For the most updated version of the Glyphs RPG blueprint, tokens, accessories and resources, please visit www.glyphsrpg.com. Also visit 2ddice.com for our internationally popular D20 RPG coins and our other masterful coin works.
Greetings, architects and travelers. So this is chapter 4, the arms or the weaponry chapter. So today, let's talk about how we make weapons and glyphs. Now, I say make because, like everything here, players and architects are supposed to make everything from scratch, and that especially applies to weaponry. Now, the reasoning is, rather than me spending so much valuable time, which I don't have, to make this large, elaborate encyclopedia of all kinds of weapons, right? Instead of me spending that kind of time on a reference book, and more importantly, you spending time to reference it, okay, it's much more efficient to be able to create your own in seconds, okay? Especially players, they like to create their own weapons. They usually have a pretty good idea of what their characters want to play, and so I found this approach easier, is to simply provide a set of metrics and have everybody create their own, like I said, in a matter of seconds generally. So how do we go about doing that? So first we need to understand that all weapons and glyphs are broken down by effectiveness ranks, which basically controls their damage, their estimated dimensions, and more importantly, how effective they are against different types of armor. Now, the armor features we'll discuss in the next chapter, but I just want to show you how they're broken down. So we have small, middle, heavy, and great. So small, they're lightweight, low damage, etc. Then you have middle, which is your standard size weapon. Moderate weight and damage, mid caliber, so forth. And then you got your heavy weapons, so pretty heavy damage there, nice weight to them, and so forth. And finally you have your great weapons, which are considered the heaviest, the biggest, and the most powerful in the game. Now, each effectiveness rank, if the architect chooses, has a strength requirement that your character needs to operate it as far as melee weapons go. Okay, so that's an option you can use there. So there's a lot of things you can do with that, but basically all you need to know for now is 4 types of categories of effectiveness. Now, what do I mean by that? Here, you will see a chart that gives you some ideas of a melee weapon dimensions, as an example, based on their effectiveness rank. So small, middle, heavy, and great. And here are some examples here. Now, you don't have to use these, but basically, this is to help you design. This is designed to help you visualize a weapon and its size and dimensions as you're creating it. So as an example, a knife, a small knife might be considered a pocket knife or a razor blade, okay? Whereas a great knife, I would consider a Bowie knife or a Gurkha knife. Okay, swords, same type of thing here. A small sword or short sword would be your gladius or even a rapier, okay, very slender weapon, versus your greatest size weapons, your claymores, your frammages, your very heavy two-handed swords. So this chart on page 66 helps you visualize dimensions on melee weapons based on their size, which is their effectiveness ranking. Okay, now same thing here, except this applies to ranged weaponry, or as I call them, advanced ranged arms, which are pistols, your shotguns, machine guns, rifles, all that stuff. Now, the way that's broken down here is by caliber. Okay, this is to give you an idea roughly of how you would treat the effectiveness rankings for firearms. So, as an example, a rifle. A small rifle, I would consider a 22. Okay, very weak caliber, used for hunting and plinking. Okay, versus your heavy caliber rifle, which is your 50 caliber, your armor piercing, your tank killing type rifle, or whatever. You know, same thing here, a pistol. A heavy pistol, I would consider a 357 Magnum or a 45, versus your standard pistol, your middle grade pistol would be a 9mm or maybe even 38 special. So again, these are not set in stone. These are just here to provide you as an example as to the dimensions and to the calibers of the weapons you can create just by effectiveness ranking. Okay, so now let's talk about arms properties. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, each weapon has an effect that it delivers on a target based on what it's designed to do. So, as an example, a dagger might be designed to pierce, or it can be designed to cleave through bone, depending on its shape and the way it's structured and so forth. So, real quick, let's go over the basic types of damage which applies to weapons, and also any kind of attack in Glyphs to begin with. So page 68 is very important to reference when you're talking about not just weapons, but any kind of attack, because that affects how a character is damaged, really. So very important to cleaving. We have piercing, striking, blasting, tearing, binding, special properties, fire, chemicals, and so forth. So let's talk about those in detail here. So the first and probably one of the most common weapon properties that you're going to see is cleaving, which basically allows a weapon to sever clean through matter. So cut through somebody's arm, decapitations, things like that. Now, before I get into the property itself, let's talk about how hit points are allocated real quick. Now, we will get into that in detail in the structure and the damage section of the book, but basically most weapons affect multiple layers, multiple body layers at the same time. So here we have tissue, which is your skin, your muscles, and so forth. The skeletal section, which is exactly what it means, bone and things like that. And then your vital organs, which keeps the character alive. So you're going to see a common alignment of 2, 4, 1 in most humanoid creatures. So 2 hit points or localized hit points for tissue, 4 for skeleton, and 1 for vitals. So most humanoid creatures have that kind of configuration, so you're going to see that a lot. Now, what I want to point out is a lot of weapons will affect multiple layers simultaneously. That instills a sense of realism and real consequences in combat. Now, some people have told me that the combat system is a little bit unforgiving. I beg to differ. It's intentionally a little more realistic because it compels you to make good decisions when you're fighting. Okay, so I'll get into that later on in the combat section. Right now, let's talk about cleaving. So, how does cleaving affect the different bodily layers at the same time? Well, very simple. Let's say I'm taking a sword and I want to cut through somebody's arm, right? Well, the cleaving property lets me do that. So let's say my weapon inflicts 6 hit points, or LHP, which are localized hit points, of damage onto that character's arm. So cleaving cleans right through it, right? So automatically damage, it's way more than 2 for tissue. So it gets clean through the skin, okay, clean through the skeleton, and clean through the vital organs. So this guy literally just lost his arm, very cleanly done, because there were 6 hit points of damage done. So that's all there is for cleaving. The second and very prevalent form of attack and weapon property damage is piercing. So lunging, thrusting strikes with daggers, spears, rapiers, stuff like that. Okay, so it is very similar to cleaving, with the exception of the rule that it does not necessarily have to deplete the tissue's LHP in order to pass through to the other layers. So that's the key difference. So, but otherwise it does carry over to each individual layer per attack. So what do I mean by that? So let's suppose in our example, our attack does 3 hit points of damage, localized hit points. Then 3 would be subtracted from 2 from the tissue. So tissue would be gone. 3 would be subtracted from 4 from the skeleton. The skeletal structure that I'm attacking, in this case the chest, still remains intact. So the piercing attack is not strong enough to go into vitals here. So the vitals are still intact. Now, let's say that the same attack did 1 LHP of damage instead of 3. Let's say it did 1 damage. So piercing attack does 1 LHP of damage to tissue. So
Normally that would not be enough to deplete it, and in this case it doesn't matter. So tissue would be left with 1 in that example, but because it's piercing, that's fine. So it would still pass on to skeleton, which would affect it by 1, so we would still have 3 left. And vitals, it's still definitely not strong enough. So in this case, the vitals are still okay. The subject's heart or whatever I'm thrusting at, in this case I'm going for the chest, so it would be the heart. So it's not strong enough to go there. So that's pretty much it. The rapier is definitely lodged into the opponent's chest here, and it did not have to fully deplete the LHP here, but I'm still a nasty blow nonetheless.
Third type of attack or weapon property is the striking property. Now, striking behaves a little bit differently than piercing and cleaving attacks, because when the attack impacts the target, the damage does carry through the different bodily layers, but it's basically muffled by the body itself, is what we're trying to reflect here. So in this example, let's say my mace or my fist or a club or whatever inflicts 4 hit points of damage onto let's say somebody's skull, right? So 4 hit points, automatically right there, tissue's gone because 4 is greater than 2. So very badly beaten and bruised is what that would basically mean. So that's gone. Okay, but as the impact travels through the bodily layers, the damage is halved. So 4 is the original damage, but by the time it gets to the skeletal section, we actually have 2 hit points of damage for the skeleton, because striking damage is halved through each layer. Vital organs, okay, 2, the half of 2 is 1. So in this case, this damage here was just enough to kill the subject. So this guy literally got his brain smashed by the weapon, barely though. So if this were a little bit less, then it probably wouldn't be strong enough to actually kill, but maybe break his skull a little bit or something. But in this case, the damage carries through in striking, but it's halved through each layer. In this case, the subject barely got his brain clobbered and is now dead. The fourth type of attack and weapon property damage is bursting. So explosive weapons, grenades, things of that nature would have this type of property. Carries through anything it touches. It literally just shreds everything that it comes in contact with. Now, to reflect this, let's use an example of a party member. Let's say he goes to jump on a grenade and use his own body to basically save his teammates. Okay, so he jumps on the grenade, and let's say the grenade inflicts 8 hit points of damage, of LHP, localized hit point damage. Now, let's say he jumps on it with his torso and covers it to protect his party members. So bursting works like this. If the total damage is high enough to go through all the layers, then that's the damage that it inflicts. So 8 hit points is done to tissue, okay, gone, vitals, gone. So the damage here, 8 hit points, very devastating blow. You could describe this character as literally been blown in half, or have a giant hole blown through his torso, but he basically saved his teammates in the process. So that's one way to describe the scenario, but basically that illustrates the bursting property. The fifth form of damage or weapon property is the tearing property. Now, not a lot of weapons will have this, except for maybe claws or whatever, but a lot of monsters will have this attack property. So their natural claws, talons, their bite attacks, things like that, that are concerned with stripping away flesh from bone, basically. They're ripping away organs and flesh to deliver damage. So tearing basically strips away layer by layer, but each layer is diluted a little bit in the process. So if the tissue is depleted. So let's say the attack inflicts 5 hit points of damage, then first off, tissue is gone from 5, and there's 3 damage left over to carry over to the skeleton. So that remaining 3 would go to the skeleton, but there's still 1 hit point left, and the vitals are unscathed. So in this case, the claw attack or the bite attack ripped through flesh pretty bad. It dented the skeletal structure pretty bad, maybe some fractures or whatnot, but it was not enough to damage any vital organs. So, because the skeleton is still intact here, so tearing damage does carry through as well, but is diluted a little bit on the way to simulate the tearing action. So, last but not least are the binding and effects attack or weapon properties. So, binding, basically any target that's entangled must overcome a strength attribute challenge versus the token's digits plus the weapon's advantage, if there is one, in order to break free. Otherwise, they're constricted. They're restrained. They can't move. That's all binding does, is trap a subject. Okay. Effects simply means a special effect, a magical spell, status, any elemental qualities or enchantments. So there's so many possibilities to get into with that it's beyond the scope of this chapter to get into in detail. So GMs can get creative with that. So weapon that's got a fire property like a flamethrower and so forth. Just an example of the effects property there. But the most important ones are the first 5, which are the most prevalent. So cleaving, piercing, striking, bursting, and tearing. Calculate an attack or a weapon's effective range. We use basically a set of a range approximations here rather than necessarily ascribing a very specific numerical value to a weapon. That saves a little time and keeps people from having to track every single number. So these range approximations give you an idea of when a weapon or attack is able to actually hit its target. So first you have the M, or the melee approximations, broken down into 4 sections. Each one is broken down into 4 sections. So M1 to M3 and M4 for melee. So M1 is 0 to 1 feet, M2 is 2 to 3 feet, M3 is 4 to 7 feet, and M4 is 8 to 9 feet. So anything in that range is your melee area. Okay, next we have the S, or the short range approximation. So S1 through 4, that's anywhere from 4 to 10 yards all the way to 500 yards. So anything happening in those ranges is considered S, or short range. So bow and arrows, a lot of primitive range weapons are going to fall in that category. Okay, R is the third kind, which are your long ranged approximations. So rifles, high powered bows, anything meant to strike very long distance is going to fall in that range. So R1 through R4 is anywhere from 501 to 3,000 yards. Okay, the fourth kind of range approximation is D, or that stands for radial approximation. So explosives, aerosols, anything that distributes in a radial pattern would go into this range. 1 through 4 is anywhere from 5 feet radius all the way to 500 foot radius. So again, you can tweak and hack these as you see fit, but these are the default values that give you a pretty good idea of an attack or a weapon's range. Okay, finally, and the rarest kind is X, which is siege approximations. So siege weapons, siege attacks, weapons of mass destruction, ancient siege weapons, things of that nature are going to attack from these ranges. So X1 to X4. So you have anywhere from 50 feet to X2 is 5,000 yards. X3 would be 50,000 yards, and X4 can be up to 500 miles. So X only applies to your hardcore siege type weaponry, but most players aren't going to be using that. They're going to fall in the M, S, and R ranges, and in some cases D if they have any explosive type of weapons. So pretty straightforward there. Look over page 69 for the specific details on range. If you ever have a pretty good understanding of weapon properties and effective ratings and basically how they affect damage, let's talk specific weapon metrics, and basically describes how every type of weapon is rated and so forth. So on page 70 we have advantage, fortitude, and load. So advantage, basically it applies during the use of melee arms or objects being used as melee weapons. So advantage is factored in when the defender blocks an attack with a melee arm. Okay, so the weapon with a higher advantage score would help basically win versus an attack attempt if the guy's trying to block. Okay, if somebody's unarmed, by default there is 0 advantage. Okay, the second metric here is fortitude, which is FHP or fortitude hit points. Basically, it is exactly what it means. It's basically like a weapon's hit points. Okay, now fortitude only goes into play when the melee weapon blocks a melee attack or strikes a hard surface. So if you got a character that got pissed off all of a sudden and striking his sword against the wall, in anger, or somebody who's blocking an incoming melee attack, that's the only time that would go into a play. So there's different levels of fortitude, okay, as you can see here. So F8 small arms, okay, inflict 1 hit point of damage to the target melee weapon. So middle arms will automatically inflict 2 hit points of damage to the melee weapon. Heavy arms, so let's say if you're blocking a heavy arm, okay, a heavy weapon, automatically your weapon is going to take 3 hit points of damage. Okay, for great arms, so a great weapon, like a great sword or whatever, automatically inflicts 4 hit points or FHP of damage to the weapon. So good luck trying to block that is what that means. Okay, if you have a replica of a weapon or a weapon-like object, like a trophy sword that's not really meant for combat, or a kitchen knife that's meant for cooking and not for battle, then any replica quality weapon or similar object by default will have an FHP value of 1/2 of what it normally would. So let's say you have a great knife, an awesome cleaving knife for cooking that normally may have an FHP of 3 or 4, let's say 4, then by default it may be 2. So just keep that in mind. That's good. That's a good thing to keep in mind when, let's say you're playing a survival scenario. Okay, a lot of survival scenarios aren't going to have real weapons on hand, but your characters may struggle to find a kitchen knife or a baseball bat to improvise with. That's when that goes into effect. Okay, load or LOD, okay, that simply means the amount of time it takes to reload a weapon. Okay, so you've got LOD 0 through X. So 0 is no reload necessary. LOD 1, it takes 1 instant to reload, and so forth. Okay, LOD X means it takes an X number amount of instants to reload depending on the GM. Okay, that especially applies to ranged antiques arms like arquebuses and old style firearms would take many seconds to reload. So that's the only time you may see something like that. Second set of a weapon, and they are capacity or CAP and stopping power, which is STP. Now that generally applies to firearms and things of that nature. So capacity is basically how much ammunition a weapon can store, what it's capable of storing. Now these are done in range, not exact amounts. So a CAP rank of low, the weapon or the magazine supports anywhere from 1 to 15 rounds of ammo. So anywhere from a small semi-automatic pistol, again, there's a little bit of leeway there. So, capacity of high can support anywhere from 31 to 120 rounds of ammo. So those are just general ranges here. Okay, as for stopping power, that's exactly what it means. So let's say you have an incoming monster attacking your character and he's running at full speed and you need to stop him in his tracks. That's essentially what that metric is for. So you see 4 ranks here of stopping power, STP 0 through 3. So STP 0 meaning there is no discernible stopping power. So the blast is going to go clean through the creature, and that monster is going to keep going unless its hit points are gone. Okay, an STP of 2, as an example, is effective within the S1 to S4 ranges, and will stop a target in its tracks for 2 instants, or roughly 2 seconds. So an STP of 3, same kind of thing. It's effective within the R1 to R4 ranges, so a lot more range there, and it'll stop a target in its tracks for 3 instants. So page 71 covers that in detail. And now let's get into the third part of weapon metrics. The third and final set of weapon metrics that we're going to look at are duration, recoil, damage, and value. So very simple. Duration, you're rarely going to see that unless you're using like an aerosol or something that has a timed effect. So how long does the effect have, or overall when it's deployed? So a DUR0, which is duration 0, it lasts for 1 instant, so there's nothing extra after that, okay? Whereas a duration of 3 can last for pretty much indefinitely. A duration 1 would mean it can last up to 5 instants or roughly 5 seconds, and duration 2 would be up to 20 seconds or so. So duration is all that means. Recoil, that's one that I find very important, especially for those characters who like to carry heavy firearms or something similar, that while may inflict a lot of damage, can be pretty hard to control. So heavy pistols or machine guns, things of that nature, could have a little heavier recoil, which basically translates to extra token slides when you're trying to use them. So an REC or a recoil of 0, there's 0 to no recoil, so it doesn't really matter. But a recoil of moderate, and to accurately hit your target and to use a weapon requires an extra successful token slide. So a recoil 2, very heavy recoil, and you need 2 extra token slides to be able to use it. An REC of 3, it's overbearing recoil, okay? And to accurately use that weapon, you need 3 successful additional token slides. So that's how we track recoil. So while your character may have a very powerful weapon, they got to be able to control it to hit their target. Okay. Next, we have damage. Now, I want to talk about that real quick. Now, damage itself, you have a general overview from what I showed you with the bodily layers, but we need to talk about how damage is inflicted based on what kind of weapon you're using. There's 2 kinds of damage, and we will get into damage in the structure and damage chapter, but basically for weapons or attacks, there's 2 kinds of damage. There's tiered damage, okay, and superficial damage or marked damage. So a tiered damage is, you'll see every weapon type has a damage it inflicts. So anything with a T, like the letter T, means tiered. And if it's tiered, in order to interpret damage, you need to read the element glyphs like I showed you earlier on. So let's say I have a weapon that does T2 damage. That implies tier 2. So to interpret that, you take the, you spend the token, and let's say the results from the element glyphs, like I showed you, amount to 2, right? So you take number 2 and you multiply it by T2, which is tier 2, which is 2. So the damage inflicted is 4 in that example. Okay, that's the most common type of damage a weapon or attack inflicts. The other kind is superficial damage, or it's less lethal, if you will. So that's interpreted using marks, or MKS, which we'll get into further. So that in weaponry is designated with a pound symbol, the little number pound symbol. So that just means spin the token and read the digits, and whatever number you come up with, that's your level of marks that you're going to take down. So 1 mark, or one LHP, 1 hit point, is broken down into 10 marks. So every 10 marks of superficial, you have a full hit point of damage, is what that means. So those are the kind of damages that you're going to be looking at, T or pound. So tiered damage or superficial damage. Finally, you have weapon value. Pretty self-explanatory. Now, weapons are, they can be ranked in pricing based on how their function is, but any upgrades they have, the materials they're made from, and so forth, or what the character had to do to get that weapon. So a lot of things can drive that. So read through that carefully. That'll give you drive a weapon's value. Okay. Now let's move on to circumstances that apply to weaponry. Special circumstances that could apply when you're using a weapon in combat. So the first, and probably one of the most common, is aiming your weapon. So The advantage of aiming, basically, your character will expend his or her turn or instant in combat at the expense of getting a little bit easier chance to hit their target. So that's the trade-off with aiming, which can be a very good thing if used properly. So basically, let's say your character wants to aim instead of just shooting the target. They want to spend their time aiming, right? So normally, in a focused attack, their target will be the dead center of the action grid, which is the bullseye. But if they're aiming for one instant, then suddenly that target becomes the square. So it expands, basically. It's a little bit easier to hit. Okay? So aiming, by default, consumes one instant within the M1 to S4 ranges. Okay? If your character is within the R1 to R4 ranges, it takes 2 instants, so a little more time involved, and aiming consumes 3 instants in time, so roughly 3.5 seconds or so. If your character is within the X1 to X4 ranges. So keep that in mind. Distance can have an effect on your aiming, okay? The next thing I want to talk about is using a ranged arm as a melee arm, which rarely will happen, but in a survival or a spur-of-the-moment situation, it can. So using the butt of your rifle to beat somebody down real quick, okay? Basically, very simple. All you do is just treat it like a melee weapon, okay? That's the answer to that. So treat it like a basher weapon, okay? So let's say I have a heavy bashing weapon or a pole melee. I would consider that as a heavy ranged weapon. So if I got a heavy ranged weapon, just interpret it as a heavy basher, I guess you could say. So if it's a small ranged weapon, treat it like a small bashing weapon, okay? And I mean, that's really all there is to it. It's just see it as a bashing object in that case. And that's in the melee weapon section, okay? Finally, object is weapon, okay? Same thing applies, right? So let's say your character is in a bar fight, right? There's no weapons around, or he got drunk and he got his weapon stolen, whatever. He gets jumped by these bandits or whatever, and he needs a makeshift dagger. So he takes the bottle, he breaks it, and suddenly he has a dagger in his hand. Now, granted, like we talked about in the fortitude section, yes, that makeshift dagger might inflict, tier 1 damage as a small dagger. That's how I would interpret it, as a small dagger. But its fortitude is obviously useless. So, I mean, experiment, mix and match however you see fit. And again, don't overthink it, okay? That's the only thing I can say in regards to that. So that's pretty much the only type of special circumstances there is to go over with weaponry. So now we're going to go over the different types of weaponry, and we're going to look at them in detail and their modifications and whatnot. The most common type of weapon or attack in an RPG is a melee arm or a melee weapon. So let's go over those real quick. We're just going to skim through this section just so you get an idea of what I mean. So page 75, there is a large chart here that breaks down the melee weapons into different groups or families or categories, however you want to call them. And it gives you the default data for each. Now, you can adjust these as you see fit. Again, just like everything in here, but these charts just give you the basic values here. So you've got knives, swords, pole arms, spears and whatnot, flexible weapons, chains, whips, all that kind of stuff, staves, axes, claws, and bashers. A basher is a mace, a flail, a bat, a hammer, things of those nature. So you got them broken down by their effectiveness ranking. So small, middle, great, or heavy and great. So 1, 2, 3, 4. And in here, you've got the data for each one. So you've got damage, range, advantage, and value. Those are the metrics that we look at for melee weapons. So let's say a middle sword, which is your katana, let's say, okay, in this example, is a damage of tier 4. The range is M3 and advantage is 5. So, and the value on that by default is moderate. So that's pretty much all there is to it. These are just default numbers to use. And in here, you have under the name, you have the types of properties that are recommended. Now, that does not mean every single knife has piercing and cleaving. Let's say you have a stiletto, right? That's a piercing knife, generally, unless you have a special one. So it's not going to have cleaving. These are just recommended values here that are here, but you get the idea. I mean, it's not rocket science. Okay, page 76, you have tempered weapons. Now, tempered weapons are basically upgraded melee weapons. So these are special kind of upgrades that you can do for melee weapons. Now, feel free to add your own and whatnot. This will give you a pretty good foundation to work with. So let's say you've got some of the defaults here. You got Slayer, Defender, Unbreakable, Endowed, Breaker, True Grip, Ornate, and Amped. So let's look at True Grip as an example. So the cost for that would be moderate, and the cost and values we'll get into in the currency chapter. That helps negate an opponent's disarming attempt during a weapon lock. So what that does, a True Grip, like a True Grip sword, would give you an extra opportunity of attack regardless of the opponent's hit modifier. Okay, as an example of tempered weapons. Next, we have ranged weapons. Okay, so same thing here. You've got all the chart data here. Primitive weapons are the first type of ranged weapons. Okay, so darts, shuriken, throwing knives, slings, chakrams, or similar weapons, tomahawks, blowguns, and bows. So your more primitive ranged weapons and their groups are listed here. So same thing here. The charts have the metrics that we look at for ranged weapons. You have damage, range, recoil, and load. Okay, and then obviously the value. Okay, the next type of a ranged weapon is probably the most common type, especially in more modern setting, your firearms, or advanced ranged weapons. So pistols, shotguns, submachine guns, machine guns, rifles, lasers, plasmas, and casters. A caster is like, plasma caster or a flamethrower or electrical weapons, or a chemical weapon, if you will. So for advanced ranged weapons, we look at the following metrics: damage, range, STP, which is stopping power. We got recoil, capacity, and load, and then obviously value. So a few more metrics here if you notice, so just keep that in mind. Okay, similar to tempered weapons, we have enhancements for advanced ranged weapons. So these are really cool because this gives you a lot of options to upgrade what may otherwise be an ordinary firearm. So cartridge options, you've got rail systems, sights and scopes, suppressors, triggers, grips and stocks, barrels, strobe lights, flashlights, special assemblies. You have jewel encrustments and whatnot to make them really fancy and expensive, and of course projectile enhancements, special ammunition and whatnot. So let's say we want to purchase the rail system upgrade for a rifle, right? That's going to be within the cheap to moderate cost values, as you see here. And the rail system simply lets you equip multiple enhancements to your ranged arm. So a grenade launcher and a flashlight or a scope, you could add that using the rail system. So just an example of the type of enhancements that you can get. Okay, for projectiles, same thing here. So different types of projectile enhancements here. So as an example, the cryogenic enhancement projectile enhancement. Basically, a cryogenic round I would consider to be expensive, and basically it's just an ice bullet that inflicts localized immobilization and potential frostbite damage, and of course it melts away in about an hour. So check out the upgrades here for the projectiles. And the last type in the firearm or the ranged category are the antique weapons. So you have pistols, blunderbusses, and rifles. So antique pistols, antique shotguns, antique rifles, that's all this really means. Now, there's no need to get into all the minutiae of the different types and whatnot, because that's a very tedious task to do, especially when you deal with history. So to make things simple, 3 types of antique weapons. So same thing here, all the metrics here, they do apply as they do with the advanced range firearms, except you'll notice that the load time is a lot higher. Okay, so as an example, let's say I have an antique rifle, right? A middle grade, pretty nice, well-rounded
rifle. The damage is T2, range is S4, STP 1, recoil 1, capacity low, so 1 bullet at a time in this case. The load time, I have it defaulted to 15 per bullet because all the time an antique weapon would take roughly. Now you can change that if you want to be very historically accurate or whatever. That's fine, but I have antiques defaulted mostly to 15. In some cases it can go down to 13 or 10. So I mean that's just there for your reference. Okay. The third type of weapon are radial arms. Okay, radial implies a weapon that affects a radius, so an explosive, an aerosol, a grenade, whatever, things like that. So same thing here, weapon data. Okay, radial, you have fragmentation, incendiaries, chemical weapons, aerosols, EMPs. You've got sensory type weapons, biological, and chemical, which are more, time bombs or whatever you want to call that. Okay, now the data that we look at here for radio weapons are damage, range, duration, and stopping power and value. So all the values here are listed. And last but not least, we have siege arms. Now again, you're probably not going to have a lot of new characters running around with these. A siege arm requires multiple people to assemble, to transport, or in a lot of cases a vehicle to use. So hardcore artillery, the most powerful weapons in the game. So siege arms are broken down as such. So you got siege melee, siege ranged primitive, siege ranged antique, and siege ranged advanced and radial. So this tries to help account for different periods in time when technology was at different levels or different settings. So on one hand you have the siege melee, which all it is a very giant overpowered melee weapon. So most player characters aren't going to see that, but enemies will. So your golem opponent might carry a giant sword around, or your mech. Let's say you're playing in a mech setting. So that's when this would apply. Okay. These are the same as the ones that I just went over, except they're a lot more powerful. Their damage and their range here is a lot more powerful. Same for radial here. So I would consider, as an example, a siege radio weapon, a damage of T500 and a range of X4 to be the most powerful weapon that you can create. So just to give you an idea of scale here. So experiment with this and see what you come up with. A final quick note on creating or even repairing weapons. So on page 87, before we get into all the example weapons that are listed, basically here you have some steps that help you craft a weapon. So basically pick a weapon class. So decide if it's melee, ranged, radial, or a siege weapon. Visualize it's the weapon itself and its function. How effective is it? Okay, so decide all that, and based on those, on all the charts and metrics, what are its properties and attributes, and define them. Okay, modify any damage, advantage, range, or any capacity metrics if that's even necessary. Is the weapon unique? What's so special about it? Okay, is it a tempered weapon? Is it an enhanced range weapon? Is it magical? That's up to you to figure out. Okay. Try to draw the weapon. Okay, there's a lot of artists involved in the gaming community. If not, just describe it in detail. That's okay too. Okay, I'm not that good at drawing, but I do like to be descriptive and creative, so that's okay. And you want to add a price tag to it. So based on its function and place in the world, you want to decide if it's cheap or if it's an exotically priced weapon. Okay, and finally, how is it obtained? Okay, is it found? Is it stolen? Is it earned? Or is it able to be purchased at a very costly price? So those are things that you want to keep in mind when you create a weapon from scratch. Now, if a weapon is damaged or completely broken, okay, here is some information about that in terms of what to do. Okay, if it's broken, it's not going to function in its optimal capacity, obviously, or at all. Okay, so the only way to repair a weapon, depending, it to the right person who can fix it, who has the right equipment and the right materials. So obviously the blacksmith in most cases, or the gunsmith, and so forth. Okay, or
If it's an explosive type equipment and it's not detonating like it's supposed to, then your bombsmith type character would deal with that. So again, pretty much common sense. Okay, now one thing that I want to note here, when repairing a weapon, as a rule of thumb, the repair cost should be about one value range less than the weapon itself. So generally it should cost less to repair than to buy a new one. Now I know in reality that's not always the case, but in a gaming setting, that's how I would do it. Okay. Now, depending on the campaign setting, weapons may also be required through the use of automated machinery, 3D printing or whatnot, or magical spells. So that's up to you to figure out in your setting. There is no right or wrong answer. These are just some pretty good tidbits of information to consider.